Hello, welcome to Pansa Pansa Live podcast. This is the second episode called Home Divide. In this episode, Baba and I explore what drives African immigrant parents and their children apart. There are two parts to this episode. There's part one, and as well as there's part two, which will be released back to each other. So listen and enjoy, and I hope you share this episode among members of our community, as many people as possible, because we have to continue to have dialogue about the challenges that is going on within African immigrant community. Thank you.
Welcome to the Panza Panza Forum. In the Yoruba language, the word panza is usually injected into poetry to express an uncomfortable, uncensored, and inconvenient truth. The Panza Panza Forum is candid conversations about the life of African immigrants in America as it relates to their adaptation to their new home. While some may find it easy to integrate and can balance between retaining the original African culture while accepting the culture of their new home, many continue to struggle to find a balance between both worlds.
On today's episode, we'll be discussing some of the factors that drive immigrant parents and their children apart. We will be touching on the conflict of cultures in the immigrant home, the pressure parents place on kids to conform to narrow definitions of success, and how African parenting skills translate in the Western society. So let's get started. Auntie Kemi, how are you feeling today? How has your day been?
Fine, I won't complain because I've been so busy all morning trying to fix my computer. Because I don't know where I got all these downloads from. So thank you, Baba, for joining me in this conversation. I really always looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Because thank you. Likewise.
You really understand how to engage, and your question is always on point most of the time. So I really enjoy having conversation with you anytime.
Likewise. So let's start off with some personal details about you that are related to today's topic. I would like to know, and I'm sure our listeners would like to know as well, what were the cultural and religious contexts in which you were raised? And by that I mean, what were some of the values you were raised in? What techniques did your parents use on you with regards to discipline, style, confidence building style, engagement with your emotions, all of that?
I was born in Lagos. I came from the Yoruba culture, and I came from a Muslim home. In my father's house, my father has many wives, so my mother was living separately from my father. So we go to my father's house, we have to dress in a form of, you have to tie your head, wear the head tie. You cannot, as a woman, you cannot have your head open within the household. At my mother's house, the rules regarding religion were more relaxed, because in my father's house, you have to pray 5 times a day. All of us wake up as early as 5:30 in the morning and pray. And when it comes to my mother's house, it's kind of relaxed, completely different. But in terms of the culture, it's well shared within the same household. I would say from my father's house, I didn't really get too much hands-on corporal punishment. My father never touched me. In my life, he never touched me. But my mother, she has used corporal punishment a couple of times in the form of a discipline. So back home, as a female, especially from my mother's side in the household, as the oldest female, an oldest female is responsible for most of the household work. And the boys, they might tell them to go and chop firewood and do some other extra stuff. But young girls are much more involved when it comes to going to the market, cooking, doing so many other things that a child is expected to do, whereby you're being given direction all the time. Apart from the household chores, as a child, first of all, when you wake up in the morning, you have to go and greet your parents. As a female, you have to kneel down. For the male, they have to prostrate on the ground and greet their parents. Yes, especially among the Yorubas. And the greeting is not just something that you greet and you go. Of course, they ask you, how did you sleep? And there's something else among the Yoruba that is so very rewarding growing up back home. There's a chant which among the Yoruba where we call Oriki. Oriki means poem that is passed down from generation to generation. And especially if your grandparents are around or an elderly person is within the household, they praise you with that chant every morning. And that's much more of feeling so empowered. It actually raises your self-esteem to look at yourself and say, oh, I am from so family. This is what my ancestors have done, because those chants is actually telling the story of each household in form of poetry. And the elders in the household actually memorize those poems and then they pass it down to your parents. As time goes on, you too, when they repeat it a couple of times, you too, you are very familiar with the chanting that is passed down to, that they use in praising you every day. So those are the basic part of the culture. And back home too, there's always a sense of community around, whereby apart from my mother, or if I'm at my mother's house or at my father's house, there's always neighbors, there are always aunts, uncles, everybody is always around to, they will embrace you and they have the right to also discipline you when you do something wrong. A lot of time when you do something wrong outside, a neighbor sees you and they find out that you did something wrong, they could discipline you. And many times you have to beg them that, please, you already disciplined me. Don't go home and tell my parents that this is what I did, because you get double. Because the whole idea is that you're not going to disgrace your family outside behaving the way you're behaving. So there's certain expectation within the society, within the community back home. And there's a sense of connection, whether no matter what language, culture that you have, everybody, especially for me growing up in Lagos, whereby there's so many different culture in Lagos, so many different ethnic group in Lagos. And you have many people who come from another country, whether they are from Ghana or from Togo. Those are very close countries that they live around the area. They could chastise you and say, you just did something wrong. You shouldn't behave like that. So there's all those connections as well. And not only regarding discipline, I remember growing up in my mother's house. My mother actually owns the house that we lived in, passed down from my grandmother. So we live there and we have tenants. To see how connected we were, if my mother didn't come home on time, the neighbor will ask me, did you eat your dinner? If I said, I'm still waiting for my mother to come home, she will offer me dinner. And the same thing my mother will do for another person's child. Even to the extent you don't even just count how many people you have within your family to cook, because you cook in a large pot, because anybody could stop by, you could offer them your meal. That's part of the tradition, that's part of the culture, which is very rich back home.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That is incredibly beautiful just to hear about the richness of community and of connection with other people. And I assume as a child, it's kind of annoying that everyone has the authority to discipline you, but but I think it's very beautiful in terms, and it speaks so much to the strength of community and in a lot of African societies. Now, we know that in America, things are set up very differently. And now you are a mother yourself to two amazing kids. So when you moved to the United States, particularly New York, which is a whole nother sort of, New York is a whole nother ecosystem on its own, right? And I feel like we can even just isolate New York City from the rest of America, and that could be a whole different conversation on its own, just raising kids in New York City. But let's just deal with the United States in general. So you moved to the United States and you have your own kids. What are some of the differences in morals, values, and ethics between the African culture you grew up in and the American culture that you were expected to raise your kids in, with regards to things like respect for elders, ways of disciplining children, the idea of children being extensions of parents in the African society, as he said, because you can't just go out and do anything and disgrace your parents, right? Because it's thought that you're an extension of your parents, versus in the US, kids are seen more as individual people. Maybe you can touch on that as well. And also with like emotional connection between like parents and kids. Those seem to operate very differently in the US and African society. So I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I will. I will tell you if I don't touch on something, just remind me because
Okay.
it's so much to talk about when it
Right.
comes to that. Like I told you, back home there was so much community connection to the extent that it takes a village. You are not really only one raising your children. Also, every other person is also helping you to take care of your children. But in this country, there's no village. It takes only yourself to raise your children. I remember when I had my son and I was in the hospital. When they brought him out, I was crying. They put him on my chest. I said, please take him because I am feeling the void of back home, whereby there will be many family members. My mother would have been there. Everybody would have been there. Because as a woman, when you have a child back home, there's always a family member who will always guide a new mother, whether giving birth, a traditional birth to that child, and many other things. Somebody will just come from the village and come and stay in your house, whether you are in the city or in the village. They will come and stay with you for like 2 or 3 months to guide you, whereby you could just lay down, breastfeed the baby, whatever you're going to eat, they will make sure. Because I think no matter what, they also understand the emotional impact of what motherhood is all about. They know they might not have a name for it in Nigeria. Here they talk about postpartum depression and all that stuff. But back home, there will always be somebody around that will help a new mother out and say, what can I do? Let me make you breakfast. Let me make you know. They will even give you back. So when my son came out and realizing that I had to do all those things by myself, it was very challenging initially. Because as a new mother, you have to learn as you progress. There's nobody to actually give you much more leeway of saying, okay, let me advise you. This is if the child should do this, this is what you do. If the child does that, if the baby does that, you do this. So you try different styles, different ways, and become to get to know what are the process you have to raise the child, being a newborn child. So all that was very challenging initially. Then come to the time when the children start growing, whereby as a parent, African parents in this country, you have to be the one to do practically everything by yourself. There's no more village. Everything is left for you. No matter what tradition that you carry from home, even if you want to practice, the structure of this society does not allow you to practice it. Because part of it, when I had my son, within 6 weeks, I had to go back to work. You have to go back to work, find a babysitter, trusting person to leave your child with. Because, this is a country whereby they don't really pay for any maternity leave. If you have a job that maybe you have some sick leave or vacation leave, you could take that because bills are piling up. So that's one aspect that as a new parent that you have to struggle with. And as the children are growing up, a lot of time you want to instill your cultural value, your religious value. For me, I wasn't such a religious person, but the aspect of the culture whereby you tend to want to teach them the language. You could speak the language, they might not want to speak the language back to you. And by the time you translate things from English to Yoruba, it's even more challenging. So many parents just go ahead and then you continue to speak English to them. Because also when you look at it from the child's perspective, whereby they have to translate from one to the other, it might be much more challenging for the parents as well as the child. Or the child don't even want to speak. You say something, they answer you back in English. So a lot of time parents just give up and say, I don't even want to be bothered with it. Regarding food is another thing. The way we cook back home is different. No matter what we cook, African children might just say, okay, I will just have it maybe once in a while. They're not going to sit down and eat all African meal every day. And knowing the way in this country is actually formulated and designed, whereby there's no time to cook different meals every day. So as a parent, you might cook maybe 2 different meals and then put it in the fridge, thinking that when they come back from school, they will actually eat that food. They might not. Because back home, people actually cook fresh meal every day. And they have different things that they eat. So you have to battle with that. You have to section extra money for that. whether they want burger or they want pasta or they want other things that they want to eat. So for me, one thing that I did was I had to teach myself different dishes that I think my children may like. So I taught myself all those so that at least I could cook those kind of meals so that I'll be able to save money for that. Those are part of the challenges. And then come to discipline. You find out that you cannot really discipline your children in America. Because not really that you can't discipline, but the way you have to actually engage in discipline is completely different. Because back home is a lot of corporal punishment. And I remember back home, there's some parents, they might not beat the child physically, but the emotional word that comes out of the mouth of a parent could be very destructive to a child. Here, you have to be creative. How do you then raise these children? How do you impose discipline? What do you have to do? Maybe you have to set up some certain kind of punishment, take away privileges. I used to tell my son, you have to write me lines. You know how you have to write me 200 lines sometimes? You know,
I remember having to do that in school in Ghana, where if you get in trouble, the teacher will have you write 1,000 lines.
Lines.
Yeah.
So, or you know, I might say, write me an essay about what you just did, and let me know how do you feel about what you just did. How do you think what your decision in doing what you did impact the family?
Do you think that was effective?
Yeah, it was effective. My son would tell you he did couple of, even as I was looking home the other day, I saw some of the letter he wrote to me, the notes he wrote regarding some of, you know, if he does something wrong, instead of me actually hitting him or something, I would just tell him to write something about what he did and what he could do to improve it next time and how he could actually adjust himself.
Yeah, I imagine that developing patience as a parent, because I find that, to me at least, parents who don't use corporal punishment, who don't hit their kids, that to me takes a lot of restraint, right? So I'm guessing it sort of built you and developed you.
It's something that developed me because when I was growing up, even though I might get a slap here from my mom here and there, but it was something that I didn't really agree with when I was back in Nigeria. It was not something that I think a child should be physically punished or verbally abused extensively because it has a lot of other damages. For me also, because coming to this country, I didn't have my children right away. I came to this country, started having children 10 years later, compared to some people who have their children right away. And I was able to see how other people were raising their children to be able to also understand the social construct of America. What are the rules? What are the regulations? What are the stressors? What are the things that you could do as a parent apart from what we have known back home? I also feel for the children because, like I just gave you all the cultural background that I grew up with. I can't wake up in the morning and start doing oriki for my children and start praising them in the traditional way. Because, first of all, a lot of time there's no time for that in the morning. Because everybody get up in the morning, they're ready to go to school. You have to wake them up, do everything, take them to school. You have to get to work on time. And there's so many things that you have to attend to as a parent in America that back home is completely different because you always have an helping hand. Back home, maybe you don't even have to drop your children in school. They know that they have to get up by themselves, take a shower, do whatever they want to do. Because when I was back home, I could go to the stream and fetch water, do my morning chores, because all those things has been instilled in me from the beginning. Even though our children here, they don't have all those demand of going to fetch water, doing a lot of all this other stuff is already in place. But there's other challenges that they face, and other challenges also for the parents. So because in America, you have to make ends meet. You're not going to go and tell them at your job and say, oh, I can't make it in every morning because I have to do this and that. They will tell you, you know, as a parent, if you cannot do what is being asked of you, then we have to give you a job to somebody else. So the structure is different. The social demand is different. So from there, like I said, I took my time to have my children. So I was able to see what other people were doing, what I won't do when I start having my own children.
Well, thanks for sharing that. So, when it comes to the fear that a lot of African parents have about the dominant culture in America, it seems like it's very present in the African home. So you
Mhm.
said that for you, it appears that you observed the dominant culture, which is, the
Yes,
dominant American culture, and
yes.
incorporated it into your household and
Mhm.
tried to find a balance because you recognized really early on that you can't be
Yes,
singing praises to your kids in America, even though that would be a beautiful thing. It's just not
yes,
practical in that
yes,
environment.
yes,
So you try to find a balance
yes.
between those two cultures. But I know that for a lot of other African parents, there's this tension, right, between wanting to preserve their African heritage and their African culture so strongly that it leads to fear of the dominant culture and it leads to, I guess, a home environment that is closed off from the outside,
Yeah.
closed off from the dominant culture, which is difficult because these parents don't recognize or don't regard. I mean, their kids are still going out there and interacting with the rest of
Mm-hmm.
the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would really love for you and us to talk more about this fear. Where is it coming from? What does it do to the kids? How does it manifest in the African home? And how does it tear and separate African parents and Americanized children apart?
For me, what I see with a lot of African parents is the lack of understanding of how American society is structured and how the whole society functions. One thing a lot of African parents are not being realistic about is that no matter how much you want to instill your culture, is within your household. Because your next door neighbors, they have different cultures from you. They have different value system from you. Of course, you could tell them certain moral value, which I think in America, many people have good moral values in terms of be courteous, be respectful, don't talk down on anybody, don't steal, don't do this, don't do that. I think what is so fearful for many African parents, I will give you back home even. Let me start from there. Because let's assume when I was growing up in Lagos, if you see some people, the way they dress that you don't really like how they dressing, or they wearing too much short skirts, or the guy acting certain way, and you feel like, no, 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 my child is not going to go and hang out with this set of people. The parents will stop you right there. Most African back home, most parents, you know your children's friends' parents because they might be next door neighbor, and you know everybody's story, everybody's history. You know who is the alcoholic parents right there that you tell your children don't go near those family because this is what they do. You know the child who skips school, who doesn't want to go to school. So many times parents will warn you against those people and say stay away from this person. But what is scary for many African parents is the perception of what they see and what they hear most of the time. So because the lack of opportunity to know the next door neighbor, to know who is on the next street that your child is hanging out with, and then the fear of the culture and the fear of the dominant culture in terms of living in certain neighborhood where they have gangs, where kids are not going to school, all this perception that is being shown regularly on TV. As a parent, you feel like I'm scared. I don't want you to become wayward because it's a fear of unknown to the extent that instead of actually as a parent find out, okay, how can I move around this? What can I do to make things better? Because no matter what, my child is still going to go out in that society. Even though every parent that I know, whether African parents, whether African American, or the Latino or any other group, most have moral value that they teach their children. But everybody have certain values that is being implemented on their children. But being that we don't really know, many parents don't know. How many African parents have other ethnic group as close friends that comes to their house or they go to their house? Hardly, because we only intermingle within our community. So many times, in some cases, is the fear of unknown. And I don't want my child out there. For me, when my children were coming up, I get to know the parents of other people that they are friends with. Okay, so is your friend. If they are from the same school, I know who they are. Constantly, if my children are going to their house to have a play date, I have contact with them. Okay, My child is going to be at your house. I know they're at your house. And I accept that, okay, it's fine. Because no matter what, as an African, let's assume some of us were living within the same community. They still have to go to school with different people from different backgrounds. They still have to work in American corporate world. They have so many things that they have to do that is not only based within African immigrant community. So you want them to be able to relate to those people. Because as long as you teach those values to your children, no matter what, they will continue to carry on that value that you've taught them from home. And one thing that I've seen among also African parents is lack of being able to have open dialogue and communication with the children.
Do you think that that's coming from the African way of communicating? I hate to generalize so broadly because that's gross over generalization, but do you think that that struggle comes from something within the culture itself, within the African culture?
Yeah, I think it comes from the culture. It comes from the culture whereby the elders always the one that they talk. When you as a child, your parents will always give you guidance. They tell you, this is what I want you to do. They might ask you question here and there, and you give response. So most of the time, parents are the one who always give direction. Elders always be the one to give direction to children, to the younger ones within the community. Of course, if there's any issue, let's assume there's a fight between two children now, and they bring it home to the elders. They might say, okay, tell us what happened. From there, you will tell them what happened. How did two of you got into physical altercation, or how did two of you got into disagreement? And then the elders will actually preside over whatever happened. They give the person who did the wrong, they give them their own judgment. Whatever is taking place, they give the judgment right there. So apart from that, you don't really have too much leeway to express your feelings. Even to tell your parents, oh, what you did is wrong. I don't agree with you. Even if you have to say there's certain way that you have to actually be able to cultivate that word in a manner that does not show too much of your anger. That is the culture that we brought in. With American children, children who were born here or brought here at a very young age, whereby they come in, they want to express themselves. You as a parent, sometimes some parents are not good in listening. They just say, I already told you what I asked you to do. That's all. Go ahead. I don't want to hear anything from you again. Like I said, if you as a parent, you are not actually looking into how can I trade in the good and the bad side of things, because our culture is not written in stone. Culture evolves, things changes according to the changes in the generation. When my great-grandparents were growing up, there's certain things that they were doing that when their own children were born, that they had to cut it down because it doesn't work at that time anymore. There's certain things that my grandmother was doing when she was young or raising my mother that as time goes on, she had to cut it off from me because it doesn't work anymore. And we don't know why certain things were being done in certain way. Maybe because of the conveniency at that time. That's why those things were being done at that time. I'm going to give you an example of a story that one therapist told on a radio that I heard one day. He said, this is fifth generation African American, whereby when they have to cook ham, they have to cut it. This generation asked the aunt, he said, why are you cutting the ham? You could cook it that as big as it is. He said, no, that's how my mother used to cut it. So I'm used to cutting ham before cooking it. He said, okay, let's go and ask grandma, why is she cutting the ham? So they went to the grandmother and said, why are you cutting the ham? He said, that's how great-grandmother taught me how to cut the ham, that I have to cut the ham in order for me to cook it. So they went to the great-grandmother and they asked her, why did you always cut the ham before cooking it? He said, because the stove were very small at that time. And they don't have big pots to be able to take the whole ham and cook it right there. So they have to cut it in small pieces in order for them to cook it thoroughly. So now that they have big stove, they don't need to cut the ham anymore. They could just cook it like that.
Right. But they've been holding on to that practice in the name of tradition.
For tradition that they didn't know how it came about.
Right. this grand idea around something that just started
Yes,
as of just plain practicality,
yes,
right?
yes, that's what it is. And the same thing also back home. A lot of time we have to see, okay, what was working at that time? For me, if a child in terms of expressing themselves, as a parents, we should be able to allow them to express their emotion. Also, you have to look at the stressor in this country. When you have to think about paying bills, doing so many other things that, as a parent, that you need to do to provide shelter, to do a lot of all these things. But we have to start understanding that the idea of just providing shelter, food, and everything is not the only thing the children need. They also need the emotional connection with the parents, emotional balance, and being able to negotiate, being able to dialogue back and forth. So that's one of the challenges that I think I see with African immigrant community that we need to start addressing.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. No, that's very insightful. That's very, very insightful.
And regarding many of you, whereby as an African children, you call yourself, and the idea that many African parents also, they look at their children, of course, they want them to be African, but your children are African American. They have that identity that has to actually be able to incorporate into their life. They are not just African. So as an African parent, you could call yourself African. Because if you come to an average African immigrant person and say, oh, how do you identify yourself? They might tell you, oh, I'm a Nigerian or I'm a Ghanaian. Most times they won't say, I'm a Ghanaian American or I'm a Nigerian American. But your generation, you will spell it out and say, I'm a Ghanaian American, I'm a Nigerian, I'm a Togolese American. You know, they list each countries that their parents actually came from. And some of our children, I've seen some of them who said, my parents are the Ghanaians, I am an American. Or my parents are the Nigerians, I'm Black American. So a lot of identity struggle is going on, and we have to recognize that as a parent.
I think what you said is very important, that some kids would completely disregard their African side. I think that's just as problematic as having kids who are forced to absorb everything African. Because I feel like maybe the kids who say, oh, my parents are the Ghanaians, my parents are the Nigerians, I'm American, that's disregarding an important part of their culture. And I feel that probably comes from perhaps being in a household where maybe the parents were so overwhelmed by the pressure of navigating this very, very difficult situation of trying to have your kids understand African culture, but also acknowledge an American culture. That's a very difficult situation. So I can imagine that some parents just decide to just have their kids be raised an American way because that's just as simple. You don't have to negotiate language. You don't have to negotiate food and whether they like your eba or they don't like your, or they like your fufu or they don't like your fufu. So maybe some parents just decide, okay, you know what? It's McDonald's. It's English. We're just going to go the American way. And to me, that makes me very uncomfortable because I think there's a lot of richness that is lost in doing that. Not only that, but as we've discussed, there's so many things within African culture in terms of just values and ethics and morals that are very, very good. Not everything, but there's some things that are amazing. And there's some things about American culture that are amazing as well. But then on the other hand, other things are damaging. So by having the two together, by filtering out the great parts of both cultures and bringing them together in your household, that gives kids so much value and so much of a dynamic personality. And so I guess that's the goal. The goal is to have households that blend the two cultures really well to give kids a more expansive experience. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, just to give you another view of things. I've listened to many of our youth, whether they're on podcast or they're somewhere talking about African parents. There's a lot of blame that they put on African parents without giving African parents credit that they are new in this country. And this is not like home for many parents. I was listening to a podcast early this year of this guy, and I'm actually going to contact him. Maybe we could interview him. He was upset with his mother initially. He felt the mother wasn't listening to him. He wasn't doing what she was supposed to do as every other mother that he meets out there. who are African American or of other culture. And he said he was very upset with his mother until when she passed. Then he started reviewing things over and over again to see some of the things that must have come into play for things to be the way it is. So one thing that I see with many of our children who are born here, oh, African parents are like this, they're blah, 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 all kinds of stuff like that. They want me to do this, they don't want me to do, without understanding what was their struggle that they are trying to navigate through the system. Because like I said, for me, I took 10 years after I got to this country to start having my children. Some came in, immediately they start having children. Within 2 years, they're already a parent. And then imagine going to school, struggling to pay bills, struggling to do so many other things that they needed to do. So it puts a lot of pressure on them. So they don't really have the time to actually understand the society that they came into. So it's part of what needs to be discussed more with many of the people within our community, whether churches and mosques and all these places that African parents gather. And I'm not saying we shouldn't listen to it. It's very, very important to have that open dialogue with our children and to be able to express some of the challenges that we're going through as well.
Wonderful. Yes, absolutely. Well, this is a great segue into the next phase of our discussion, which is about the pressure to conform to narrow definitions of success. So I think that's another hot spot for the divide between African parents and their Americanized children. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who's listening. Thank you for tuning in. And we hope to have you back here with us on the next episode of the Panza Panza podcast as we continue to explore the nuances of the African immigrant experience and beyond.